Hello and welcome to the Michael Mama Show. I'm your host, Michael Mamas, and we're coming to you from Mount Soma, home of the Sri Sameshwara Temple in the mountains of Western North Carolina. And today, this is a pretty interesting topic today. We're going to talk about demagoguery. But before we get into all of that, there's just some things I wanted to bring up. Here's one thing that I found amazing. Harvard University hired an atheist to be the chaplain. Now, when I first heard that, I don't know. See, that I have kind of two different responses to that kind of a thing. First of all, I get it. In that a lot of people now are kind of down on religion because what they were taught about religion when they were kids, it doesn't make any sense. God's up there, some guy's sitting on a cloud, and and I think that's pretty much among the sophisticated types. They kind of that viewpoint of spirituality in general. And I agree with them that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but there's a deeper level of understanding. And I think it's ironic that a place like Harvard University, you would think in their comparative religion classes or whatever, they would have some deeper understanding of spirituality that would be significant enough in the climate of the university that they would realize that, an atheist is missing the fundamental point of spirituality. I don't know. I know when my daughter was getting ready, she was in high school, getting ready to go to college. She ended up going to Chapel Hill, but she was looking at Ivy League schools and Harvard and that because she had good grades and she could. Well, it's tough to get into Chapel Hill, and she did. But I remember some people that were really in the know were saying, "Do not send your kid to Harvard." I even remember Maharshi used to call it, what do you call it, a dead cat, Anyway, not to get too much off on a tangent on that, but when I heard this thing about, they hired an atheist to be chaplain for the university, I thought, okay, kind of makes sense in a sense. Another thing, there's this idea of open-mindedness. I've been watching the U.S. Open. I like tennis, and so I like to follow it a little bit. And there was a commercial on there, and it just said, "Be open." And probably play on words, U.S. Open, but of course, be open. And here's the thing about being open-minded. In the drug culture, your mind can get open in two different ways. It can get refined and cultured and blossom naturally and be open-minded, or it can get blown open, torn open. And drugs will do that. And so, I think you've probably seen people that are just kind of torn open. And but it doesn't have to be that dramatic a thing. But nevertheless, the subtlety of the mind, the subtlety of the awareness, they're open, but they're blown open, And so I'd like to say that, chakras are supposed to blossom, not detonate, So that's something I thought about. And, then they use this word, and I don't mean to be too critical of any one group, but I guess at former President Obama's birthday party, they weren't wearing masks and things, and they were all in close quarters on that. And they said, somebody said, the rationale was, we're all sophisticated. I don't know what that would have to do with the transmission of a virus anyway, if they're all not wearing masks, if you believe in masks, and if they're all, in close quarters like that. But also, if you look at the videos, that's not my idea of sophisticated people. I mean, I don't mean to be judgmental, but, they have videos of the people, and I think we have an idea who's attending. And so the whole idea of sophistication, well, I guess that fits into demagoguery, which is the subject of this podcast that we'll get into, which was interesting how it developed. But that's something I think to think about. Also, now Afghanistan, I mean, geez, even thinking about what happened there and what's going on there is just horrible to even think about. It's a very dark cloud on our whole planet, you know. But if it does have one silver lining, I think it's that it's really a catalyst, and we have a number of them, but that's what happened in Afghanistan is a major one. It's a catalyst for people finally waking up and saying, wait a minute, you know, we're on the wrong track. We're not thinking right. Things aren't set up right. We got to do a redo, you know. So I think it is happening. You know, it's interesting to me. I saw a poll about, you know, President Biden and what do you think of his overall performance? And it was kind of low, 40 some percent, something like that. But then you looked at specifically, what did you think did you think of his performance in Afghanistan? He was, I think, in the high 30s or 40, low 40%. And I was like, well, I mean, it's obviously, it was a mistake, okay? And it was obviously a mistake. And so it makes me wonder who were the 30 or 40% in these polls. It's almost like, well, that's one of the things, you know, people get so identified with one group that no matter what that group did, they just still support them. And so these polls, you got to realize that we're just talking about 30% on each side that's not going to waver, period. And so you're only looking at the internal mix, you know, which doesn't feel right to me, you know. I mean, people should think for themselves, you know, more than that. But all of these things, all the terrible things, Afghanistan and all the conflicts and wars and everything, and all the craziness that's going on in even our nation today and the world today, none of that needed to happen. And the ancient seers provided us with the technology to remedy that so that it wouldn't happen, so that people could live in abundance and prosperity and happiness and harmony. But it's hard for us to believe, I think, a lot of times, that how could the ancients have known that stuff? But I think we take a big step forward in our progress as thinkers when we realize there's knowledge, and then the knowledge gets lost, and then it gets regained, and then it gets lost again. I mean, it's in the Veda. Thousands of years ago, they knew the earth was round, you know, and then it came along later, and, you know, they think the earth is flat. And then somebody came along and said the earth is round, and they burn them at the stake, you know. And now we realize, of course, that the earth is round again. There's so many things like that. The ancients knew so much. And the real portal to that thing is for me and I mean, the Egyptians had knowledge, but it got burnt down, lost in Alexandria when they burnt the library or what have you. But the Vedic texts are still there. The Vedic cognitions are still there. And all that knowledge is there, but it's ignored. And you might say, well, how can they possibly ignore it? Why would they ignore that? Demagoguery, which we'll get into. But it's such a waste. And in the Veda, there is a technology, and that's what Mount Soma is all about. But people get so caught up in their identity with a particular worldview, a particular demagoguery, you know, that even though it's there, they won't look at it. Or, oh yeah, well, that can't possibly be right. Why? Because it's not part of their world. It's not part of their naive rationality, it's called. There was a website talks about the characteristics of demagoguery. Now, what is demagoguery? I think a lot of us have heard the terms, but I don't think many of us have a very rigorous definition of it. And the way I get into this is on the news, somebody used the word, and they use the word frequently. And I was like, I have a feeling of what demagoguery meant. But I thought I'd, look into it. And I looked it up and found some dictionary definition that said demagoguery is having a belief or a viewpoint that's not based on rationality and logic, but it's more based on emotion. And if you go in and search characteristics of demagoguery, there's a website that comes up. Actually, it's patriciarobertsmiller.com. But if you just type in characteristics of demagoguery, it should come up, and it gives a list of. It's interesting to read. I don't think it was well written. To me, it's a little too recondite. It's almost like a bit of a pedantic, I guess. The way she writes is kind of unnecessarily convoluted and complex and things, but nevertheless, the points are, I think, extremely important. And demagoguery is so pervasive. I've talked about even in physics. The Big Bang Theory, they calculate how old the universe is, and then with the Hubble telescope, they see a galaxy out there that's older than how old they say the universe is. So obviously something's wrong. What do they do with that? They ignore it because they're so caught up in their little belief system, their naive rationality, and that's everywhere. It's everywhere. Now, the whole idea of demagoguery, then there's a demagogue, and a demagogue, Hitler, people would say, was a demagogue. People just worshipped him. He offered his whole worldview. It didn't really make a lot of sense in a lot of ways, to go be killing innocent people or whatever. But nevertheless, he captures the emotion. It's an emotionally based thing. And there's usually an in crowd and then the out crowd. And the in crowd looks down at the out crowd. And the in crowd is the sophisticated ones, and the out crowd are lesser than. The in crowd can do things wrong, but oftentimes they have the rationality, like, what would be a good example? KKK, the out crowd, the in crowd then would be, on the fringe would be Antifa, or vice versa. You have the conservative group, and KKK is on the fringe, and then the out crowd would have Antifa. And one just says, well, we're not so bad with Antifa because look what the KKK did, or the KKK. Well, we're not so bad. We had the KKK on the fringe, but look what Antifa is doing. And so the whole thing becomes convoluted and rationalized, and just becomes a big mess. Okay. One principle that I heard that I liked, and that is that the volume is inversely proportional to the sincerity. You'll see this in just daily life. If somebody's really trying to convince you of something, and the volume could be very high. They could be yelling. They could be pushing. But oftentimes, the louder the volume, the less the sincerity. And if something is simple and true, a sincere person may not even feel the need to go ballistic with it. So that's something I think to watch for. A thing I liked. Here's another thing I saw that I think is good to know about. And I know I'm jumping around here, but we'll get these done and then move on. Electric cars, they're igniting the flames. They're bursting into flames, and it's batteries. And it's interesting that G. Gordon Liddy, who was, a while ago, when he first heard about electric cars were going to be coming out, he said they'll burn up. Now, why is that? Because there's such a high voltage. The voltage in our homes is 110, and then for very heavy appliances, sometimes you need 220. Well, the Porsche electric car is 800 volts, which means there's a lot of oomph behind the electrons, which means that they can jump arc and cause fires. And so in Europe, in the courts in Europe, they just settled, and the manufacturers of electric cars, Tesla has to compensate people for their losses for their cars just spontaneously combusting, And what's the guy's name? Mark Garagos. I think he was the attorney for O.J. Simpson case, I think. But at any rate, he's filing a class action lawsuit against Tesla. So if you're thinking about buying an electric car, it might be a good idea to hold off until they straighten it out or whatever they come up with, But I'd like you to know about that. I think it's important. Another thing is the chakras. There are the 7 main chakras. First chakra, and then 7th chakra, crown chakra. First chakra's at the base of the spine, like that. And then in those of you who've done all the advanced techniques, the latest advanced technique I taught, we worked with the upper 7 chakras and the lokas associated with them. But there's 7 more chakras that are below. And that domain is called Patala. And it's interesting, because here's the thing, there's a physics to all of this. Just like there's a physics to our bodies, and it's all physics, electrons, protons, neutrons, and all that. But what really gives it meaning, you see, is the personified correlate. When you look at me, you're not saying, oh, there's a bunch of electrons, protons, neutrons. It's a persona, it's a person. And so like that, all this Vedic knowledge also has the corresponding personified correlate. The language, the real language of the Veda is all about personas, which is very interesting. The technology of that unified field, that deepest level, is a technology of personas. In a superficial sense of the word, prayer. In a deeper sense, we call it yajna, or pujas. But they have a corresponding physics to them, you see. And it's important to understand that, both of those things are there. So the personified correlate to the 21 chakras is that the upper chakras mapped onto the planet Earth, northern hemisphere is the upper chakras. And Lord Vishnu put his foot on the head of some guy. I'm sure put his foot on his head. Bali's this guy's name, and he drove him down through all 21 chakras all the way into Patala. Now, Patala, is sometimes called the underworld, and in the West, we think of underworld, we think of hell and bad, stuff, and that's not it at all with respect to Patala. It's different. In fact, it's supposedly incredibly beautiful, even the most beautiful planes of existence. So that's something I think it's good to know about, and just sharing that, for what it's worth. But the main thing I want to get to here today, though, to get back to it, is the whole thing about the demagoguery. And there's demagogue. I gave a few examples that people might consider this person to be a demagogue, like Trump or Obama or Hitler, or there are tons of them. And then there's also, though, the idea of the demigod. A demigod is like Hercules, a person that was half human, half god. And of course, a lot of times people get so caught up in their adoration of a demagogue that they elevate them, at least in their own mind, to a demigod. But what's really interesting to me is that when I got into it more and more, and started reading about demigods and read this thing about the characteristics of demagoguery, it almost became, well, it did become, even Vedantic in nature. Vedanta is the completion of a major portion of the Veda called the Upangas, and it's the means of acquiring knowledge as viewed from. It's as if God was watching life in the relative evolve, and it progressed, and found its fulfillment in Vedanta. And that's the Upangas. Then there are the Vedangas, which is generally a study of literature, but really it encompasses much more than just literature. Literature illustrates it nicely, because you start with a vowel or a word, a letter, and then you create a word, and then you create a sentence, and then paragraphs, but again, it includes way more than that, and it culminates then. And see, that's experienced not by kind of God observing you, but it's taken from the perspective of the experiencer, the relative evolving, and the experience from within the relative, and the evolution then to liberation, to full knowledge. And so in that sense, then the commendation in Vedanga is called Jyotish, light. So you see the light. And a small aspect then of Jyotish is Vedic astrology. But it's interesting, that don't we all commonly say, oh, I see the light, or do you see the light? Well, Jyotish means light, and that's the culmination of the acquisition of knowledge, which I think is really interesting. But the thing is, the more you study demagoguery, and if you wanted, you could get into this thing with the characteristics of demagoguery. I found it interesting, even though I didn't think it was written very well, to be honest with you. But terms like naive realism, there's an attitude that, oh, this is reality. This is how reality works, but it's naive. And that's foundational to demagoguery. And also there's authoritarianism. It can be due to convention, that it's just tradition, and that becomes like an authority. Or it can be your demagogue, and whatever your demagogue says, that's authority. And so that's what you follow. And it's also another interesting aspect to it is that there's this notion of better than. Well, if you're a member of the in group, then you're just naturally better than the outsiders, the out group. And so it becomes a justification that you can do bad things, but because you're in the in group, it's okay. But if the out group does the same bad things, then it's not okay. And you'll see that in politics, for example. But the thing is, what happens? What happens with all this is the more you get into it, the more you look at it, the more convoluted and twisted and erroneous the whole arena of how people think. Because everybody's got their own demagoguery. Everybody's got their own worldview. Everybody's got their own belief system. And these things, the more you look at them, the closer you look at them, the more they self-destruct. And so what do you end up with? No thingness, pure isness, beyond relativity, the futility of relativity in that sense. The only true knowing is knowing that you know no thing. It's beyond thingness, you see? And so I found it fascinating because I went from a very simple, well, yeah, I kind of know what demagoguery is, but they're using this word, calling this guy a demagogue. I'm going to look it up, and it's, it's a viewpoint that's based not really on rationality, but is based more on emotions. And then there's the whole thing is you look at it deeper and deeper and get into naive realism, and it's just becomes so fascinating that the whole thing becomes meaningless, and then it becomes, and all the different metaphors cascade out of it. good versus bad. We're the good guys, we're the moral guys, and they're the bad guys. And it's just the way human beings think, it's the way we think. We're very relativistic in our thinking, very polarized in the very nature of our thinking, and then we try to one example is, abortion. Now they just came out with this thing in Texas, turn over Roe versus Wade. And some say, well, life begins at conception. Other people say, well, life begins when they detect the first heartbeat, which is what they're saying in Texas now, 6 weeks, roughly. And but others might say, well, the brain isn't developed yet. So maybe until there's a brain, the developed brain, then how can there be life in that sense? Because, the point being, I'm not trying to take a stand here, but I mean, every cell in your body has some life to it. So does that mean it's, anyway. But the point being then that we have a feeling, and that feeling then has a rationale that rallies around it. And so we rationalize our viewpoint, whichever viewpoint it is. And then we become so adamant about it that we feel like there's scientific proof. Life begins at conception, period. Other people have said that life begins when the soul enters the body, and that can happen even much later. I'm not taking a stand here, believe me. I'm just really, we're talking about demagoguery and its implications and how it permeates everything, and how we become so righteously indignant with regard to the demagoguery that we adhere to. But the reality is then that if we're caught up in the tailspin of demagoguery, we're like a kite without a tail. There's no basis. There's no real basis. It's based on our emotions, our feelings, and the dance we do around those feelings. Thoughts matter little. It's how we feel about those thoughts that make all the difference. And then we construct a whole world view, a naive rationalism. Rationality is what they call it in that article, at any rate, to justify what we feel. And it's worth thinking about. So what happens? What does it happen when the kite has a tail? What is that tail? The tail is, and it's interesting because, like some of these people say, well, the only cure, the only solution for the whole COVID virus thing and everything that's going on is God. God will intervene. And on one level, it's like, come on. But on another level, that's what we're talking about here, in the sense that there's a unified field. There's an underlying basis for existence. There's a source of harmony, one thing out of which all things emerge. And when we're rooted in that, it's like we're rooted in Mother Earth. The wind, it's like Mother Earth. It's like a tree is rooted in the earth. And the wind can blow this direction and that direction, but if the tree is strong, it stays stable and prospers even in the greatest of storms, because it's rooted in something. And we can be rooted in what? It's called the self. The gateway to that transcendental absolute level is the self. It's not about demagoguery. It's not about identity with perspective. It's about being established in the transcendental, the self on the deepest level. To thine own self be true is a very profound statement, really, but how many people really know what it means on the level we're trying to talk about here now? Scotty, anything else you want to say about it all?
Yeah, it was when I was looking up the demagogue thing, it's funny how initially when the word was coined or when they started using it, they said was in ancient Greece, and there was no negative connotation
That's right.
to it. It was just a term that when they started democracy, it was just they were coming from the leader would come from a lower class. But and it's also interesting to see how now some of these traits that are associated with it are, the elites were kind of upset because if the leader came from a lower class, then there was they had an issue with it. So how the word transformed over time is just, that's
It's
interesting.
interesting. Yeah, there's been periods of time when the word was had a positive connotation. There are periods of time when it had a negative connotation, and it cycles.
Right.
And that's just like the world is round. No, the world is flat. The world is round. The world is flat, and it just cycles. Right now, we live in a time where so much knowledge is being rejected. It's in the Vedic literature. It's there. It's there, and you can pick up translations and read them. But it's unbelievable how much it's ignored. I, I I'm almost at a loss. I mean, why? But why? Well, that's what happens. We live our lives. We get caught up in an arena of thought and feelings and emotions, and then we only accept what's part of that little demagoguery that we become aligned with and feel an emotional connection with. And that's what we believe. One last thing, great example, and this has become an infamous example in the school. I was given a class once, and somehow it brought up the subject of supply and demand. And so to illustrate supply and demand, I said, well, if there were bushels of corn lying all over the place, you couldn't even get rid of it. So it wouldn't cost very much. You could sell somebody a bushel of corn for 2 cents and be glad they're taking it away for you. But if there's only one bushel of corn in the whole world, that's going to be worth a lot of money. People are going to pay a lot if they want some corn. That's called supply and demand. The greater the supply, demand goes down, So that's a very basic, fundamental principle of economics. And a professor was just telling me just the other day that the world is so crazy right now that if they can teach about a course in economics and people can at least understand supply and demand, they feel like they've succeeded. But it's so basic. And the funny thing is that we all have opinions about the economy and about welfare and about all these economic laws and taxes and this and that. And people can't even understand or don't even accept supply and demand. When I gave that talk about it, people got hysterical. People were yelling in the room. They were upset. Somebody in the back of the room yelled out, "I hate money." And I was being criticized for just trying to explain supply and demand, And so what chance do we have? There was a guy in France in the 1700s, I think it was a Frenchman, and he said, democracy will come to its demise when people realize they can vote in free stuff. Has no regard for the economic basis, but it's epidemic. And if you're a politician and you want to get elected, promise free stuff, And so talking about demagoguery, and its implications and where it can lead. So people, if you get established in the sense, in the self, then you're sensing into that one thing that's common to all aspects of life. That's why it's called common sense. And as the common sense refines even more, then you become wise. That's called wisdom. Okay, Scott, if there's nothing else, I think that'll do it for today.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, good. All right. Thanks everybody for listening.